Okay, so unfortunately, I've lost the last recording, which was about 20 minutes, I think, due to an issue with ScreenFlow. So I thought about just acting as if it never happened, but this is going to pretty much destroy the purpose of these videos because it's so that you see how it can work. Now, let me guide you to the different steps that I made. The issue with the previous implementation where I stopped was that we didn't catch any of the exceptions of our custom exceptions, and our this was like the main reason. So we didn't catch the exceptions. So what I did instead is I created a new execution closure class, which extends from the base execution closure that comes with SciShell. There we receive the shell and the line of code that we want to execute. I'm calling it with the underscores in here because what SciShell does is it extracts the scoped variables so that if I go in here and I do $i equals to 10, press enter, and now the next time I would use this variable, it would restart this again. So it extracts these scope variables so that we have access to them again. With our line of code, this would mean that if we just call it line, then you couldn't use a variable called line. So that doesn't make sense. And we are using this extract skip, which means that skipping the variables that already exist. Then we add the code to the shell, execute it, and then I have basically wrapped the code execution is this try catch block. And then we have this whole thing wrapped in another try catch, which is then writing these exceptions into our shell so that when we do something stupid, we get these exceptions written in here. And yeah, like this. Okay. Yep. So that's pretty much what we want to do. Now, the next thing, besides cleaning this up, of course, is we need some kind of socket server in place. So we would need a socket server around this that would listen for incoming payloads. So the payload, for example, would be a serialized object. Then we would unserialize the object, dump the object by default, and add it to the scoped variables so that we can then use it later on in here. So let's see how we can do this as well. When we take a look at the documentation from React PHP socket, I think we haven't added this yet to our package, so let's do a composer require of React socket as well. Is it in here? No, we haven't added it yet. So let's do this. Okay, and now what we want to do is we want to start the socket server in here. So if we take a look at the documentation, then we have, I think the very first example is a simple server. Yeah, so we have the event loop. We already have the event loop for our standard in, standard out. And then we have the socket. So let's just move this in here for now, like this. So let's import the classes. So we have a new socket server. This, of course, needs to be configurable later on. Then we have this. Okay, so we start the socket server, and whenever we receive a new connection, we could output some information. We don't need this. And when we receive data, we would need to unserialize the data and dump data on our shell. Yeah, pretty much like this. So we would start the socket server, then we create the loop, we create the shell, we have this prompt, and then we have this here, which is going to use our shell. When we receive data, we are also going to use the shell. And oh, we already have a use in here. Like this. And then when we unserialize whatever kind of data, we are going to basically do a shell set scope variables. Previously, we would do a shell get scope variables. Like this. Then we would somehow need to unserialize data and add the structure, and then we would do something like new variable is going to be equal to the unserialized variable, like this. Then we set the scope variables, and that's pretty much what we want to do. And then we would again do this, execute the shell, like this, with the variable name just to dump this. New variable. Then we would execute it, and then we need to output the result. Yeah. So I think then we could basically do this. I know this is writing to the connection. We don't want this. Yeah, then it's basically this info, this shell output fetch, like this. Okay, so this is pretty much the whole logic in place, I guess. We have to do some things like aliasing the classes so that we can use the user class, and then it would get aliased to our custom app model. We need to do this. But other than that, I think this is at least going to be the proof of concept kind of thing we want to do. Okay, so let's just leave the code in place like this and see how we can make this thing work. So I think we can have this should be configurable. So this is pretty much similar to the dump server. So if we take a look at the Laravel dump server package from us, then we have this config, and then we have the host. So this is pretty much what we want for the Tinker server as well. So we can add this to our config. Then we have the host, and let's just use 9914 for this. Okay, and then in our command, we can use config laravel tinker server.host, use the loop, okay, and then we have this ready to go. And now we need some kind of function that we can use in our Laravel application to send data to this socket. So we are going to create let's create a file called helpers.php. And we have if function exists. Let's just call it tinker. So if the tinker function does not exist, we're going to create it. And what I want to do is I'm going to steal this one from Caleb Porzio. I think that's the right name, the way to pronounce it. He did a really cool helper function, which is one of the ways that inspired me to do this. He had this tinker function, and what it does is when you call the function, it would spawn a new shell. Basically what we are trying to do, but his implementation only works in a command line environment because it's not using sockets. So instead we want to use this basically with our socket, and he did some crazy stuff in there. So where can we find the code? Oh yeah, he did this awesome helpers repository. There is the helpers tinker helper. All right. So yeah, he's doing a lot of crazy stuff to pull out the variable names that you put in here, because what you can do is have these arguments like this, and if you call it with, let's say, tinker$user, then what we want to have in PsyShell is have the variable called user. But since we only have this args parameter in here, we do not know what the variable was once called once the user wrote this. So what he does is basically using debug backtrace to find out the variable name. So that's also what we are going to do now. Let's credit him for this. Thank you, Caleb. See, and then link. All right. So then we have the name parameters, and using this, we know what to send to our socket server. So as you can see, we have these scoped variables. Yep, that's nice. And then, yeah, this is what we need. So, all right. What we need to do now is see if there is a socket open and then send the information over to our socket server. So if we take a look at how the dump server package does it, it's from Symfony in the var dumper, and then they have this server dumper, and there they are just checking is it in the right? Is the connection? Yeah, so it's just checking in the create socket if it can create it in a try catch, and otherwise it's just, in this case, dumping the information. I'm not sure if we want to do this as well. So if the server is not started, that we just dump the information instead of tinkering. Maybe that might be kind of nice. Yeah. Okay, so we have this thing, then we have the stream socket client, which has the host. The host is going to get extracted from this string. Okay, so this is the config value basically. And then it's going to write some data to it. Okay. So we can basically do the same thing. So in here we can go and create a new class, Tinker server connection, or let's just call it connection, maybe that's better, in the correct namespace. It pretty much like this connection, we would have the context, the host, sorry, we don't have anything else. So let's have a constructor where we accept the host and we want this accessible. Then we would have the socket. We would have something similar to the create socket method that we have in here, and also null error handler, so that we can ignore if the socket doesn't work, like this. Yeah, we want to connect or async connect. We have the null error handler, and this is going to create the socket client for us. Nice. Okay, and then we have something similar to this. So we are going to write some kind of data. So go to our connection, and then we would have write, and then we would have the variable, let's call it named parameters, just as we did with the values in here. So named parameters. Okay. Then we have the connection, and then we would write the named parameters to this socket. So okay, if we don't have a socket connection, we are going to create one. All right. That's fine for me. And then we have this context information that we are going to serialize. Okay, and then it's basically this try catch, which we also want. So in here we would like to serialize data that needs to be sent. And then we have this. Okay, so then we would try to send the data to the socket, shut it down, create a new one afterwards. If it's not fresh, send this. All right. Okay. And this is going to return a Boolean whether or not the data could be sent to the socket. So then we still need this encoded payload thing, which is in our case going to be a serialized version of the named parameters. Do we need anything else? I don't think so. So basically we just base64 encode the serialized named parameters. But in our case, this needs to go into the try catch as well, because if you want to send something that is not serializable, then you cannot tinker with it. So this doesn't work in our case because we need to send the data somehow from the web context to the socket, and we need to serialize it. So if you want to tinker something that is not serializable, it's not going to work. Okay. And yeah, this is then going to return a Boolean. And this is going to be an array, the named parameters. So now our helper would create a new connection with the Laravel Tinker server host. And then it would try to connection write the named parameters. And if this does not work, then we would like to dump the arguments that we received in here. Okay? Does it make sense? Yeah, it does make sense. At least to me. I hope it makes sense to you as well. All right, now we have this helper function in our application, in our package, but we haven't told Composer about it yet. So we have PSR4, and then we also have files, and one file that we want to autoload is in source/helpers.php. So now we need to do a Composer dump again in here to dump the autoloaded files. And now let's see if we start the Tinker server, React socket server not found. Okay. We also need to do a Composer update to load the new dependency in our Laravel project. Okay, and now if we start the server, now our socket should be open. So if we now go to our Laravel Tinker server test again, and then just do a tinker. And let's just do something. $e is going to be 10. All right, and then I want to tinker 10, tinker $e. Failed to open stream, no such file directory, source helpers. Am I missing something? It's in Laravel Tinker server, source, helpers.php, on line 16. Okay, it's unable to get the location because it's not in a file, because we're doing this in here. Okay, so let's try this in a web context instead. So if we do this in our routes, then let's just do something like this. Now, if I go to Laravel Tinker server test.test, this is open and our socket got called. We haven't changed anything in here yet, but we can see when we refresh the page, we get the data inside of our socket application. Oh, and when the server is not started, we don't return anything yet. It's not what we want. So if it doesn't work, we need to return false. Yeah, that makes sense. So in this case, we're just dumping it. And if it exists, on the other hand, so if the server is started, we refresh. Okay, so I figured out what was causing the issue. And that's when we created the socket connection. It needs to be a synchronous connection, not an asynchronous connection that for some reason is not working as expected. Okay, so with all these error handling in place again, what happens now is if we go to the website and refresh and the socket server is started, we receive the input. So we get something to the socket. And if it's not started and we go to the web page, we have a dump of the information, which is pretty much what we want. So now we need to handle the incoming data in our socket connection. So in here where we have this pseudocode, we need to unserialize the data and then handle it from there. So unserialized data is going to be unserialized data. And then we got the scoped variables. And if we take a look at what we have in the unserialized data, oh, and it's a base 64 decode. And then, oh no, the other way around, right? First need to base 64 decode the data and then unserialize it. Okay, and then we can take a look at what it looks like. So in this case, it's false. Okay, let's see. What are we doing? We're base 64 encoding the name parameters. So let's try again. False, okay. Oh, while testing, I removed the serialize. So we're serializing the name parameters and base 64 encode them. And there we have it. Okay, and then once we have this, we need to set the scope variables, which is basically a merge, an array merge of the unserialized data and variables that were already in place. All right, I think then since you can dump multiple variables, I could use ls, I think. Let's see. Let's start this, go here again. This is now null, but if we type $i, we have 10. Okay. All right. How can we dump the information immediately? Maybe, what's he doing here? Yeah, this only works if the shell has these variables. Okay. So the problem is that we could have multiple variables. Because you could do something like, if we go to the Laravel app, you could do this and dump both of the variables, which works. And then in here, we have access to j and to I. Okay. But I want to dump them, so maybe it makes sense, since we have these variable names, that we loop over the unserialized data. So we could do something like collect unserialized data keys map this was then the variable name, and then we could use the shell in here. Then we could do something like dollar and then the variable name. So this way we would dump all the variables that we receive. So if we go here, then we have 10 and 20 afterwards. No, and we would need to do this as well. So try again. Okay, so then we would have the 10 and then we have the 20. Do we actually need this? Or does the execution automatically dump the information? No, it doesn't. Okay, so then we would need to do something like maybe only output right. And then have this output in here. Yeah, so then we would have 10 and 20, but it would be nicer if we can also see the variable names. So let's also output this. So we're going to do something like yeah. Okay, let's try this again. Okay, now the double arrows are a bit confusing. So let's also add a new line. Now, okay, so this is better, and now we can use something like this and use this to evaluate what we actually have. Okay, maybe let's add the line break in here so it looks similar to this. So then we would not use right, but right line. Here are the same. Okay, we don't need right line here because the shell output already contains the new line. Okay, cool. This looks pretty good. So now we have both of the variables and then we receive the outputs. And now if we go to our Laravel app and we do something like Tinker user find one. Does this work as well? Okay, class user not found, of course. So app user find. And in here we now, well, okay, we have this temporary variable, which is fine because we haven't defined the name for it. But we get the dump and then we could do all kinds of stuff with it. So update the name, save it. And now if we refresh, we should get a new dump with our updated name. Cool, okay. That's pretty nice. So now we have the basic functionality in place, I think. So we can now dump data from our browser to the command line in the Tinker shell and then play around with it, which is pretty amazing. Okay, cool. So now it's all about cleaning up this mess that we created in here. So the connection class is fine the way it is. We can leave this. We have this Laravel Tinker server class, which we do not need at all. And the facade is also not needed because we have our helper method. Then the service provider, let's clean this up. We have the singleton for the facade. We don't need this. We have our composer JSON where we have the alias with the facade. We don't need this. Okay, so now we have the config in place. We have our command. That's looking pretty good. Okay, so now we can do this in a more nicer way. So the whole PsyShell thing, that could be done in its own class, and then we can create the class manually, I think. Yeah, that might be the best option. Do we need to pass anything to it? No, not really. And then we have these casters. To support the aliases, I think we can do it similar to what Laravel does. There we have there's Illuminate. Where is it? Here, Tinker. And what they do is they have the Tinker command where they create the shell, and then they have this. They also have the config, and then they have this class alias loader from Tinker. We have these casters, but we all have them in place already. So I think this is what we need as well, the class alias loader, so that we can only require the classes without specifying the namespace. Okay, so let's see. In our command, we are creating in here. We have the loop, that's fine, we can leave it as is. We have the buffered output, that's also okay for me. Then we have the socket server, and the loop, and the shell. Okay. So first of all, let's import Laravel Tinker as a dependency so that we can do the autoloading. Okay, now that we have this, we can make use of this autoloading similar to what we have in here. So we need this, and we need it here when we create the shell. So we use the autoloading class maps, then we have this class alias autoloader that we register. Then we have this shell run, which we don't need, and the loader unregister. We also don't need this in here. Okay, so I think like this should work. Let's see. Once we start the Tinker server and then try user equals new user. And we have the aliasing. Cool, okay. That's great. Then this is all okay. We have this new line. This is also pretty fine for me right now. And this needs some more error handling, because if we send some data that we cannot handle, well, does it happen? I don't think. Then we have the scope variables. This is also looking good. Okay. Now, one thing I don't like in the current implementation is that we have these kind of warnings and we see them not in the correct style. So maybe instead of doing the standard IO write with the output, we could do this output write. Because this should convert. No, it doesn't. Probably doesn't apply the styling automatically. Okay. I'll have to see how we can make this work. Okay, but that's pretty much all we need. It's not that much code. And we got the base functionality working, which I still think is pretty amazing. So that we can just go in here and dump something basically, but also tinker with it. That's cool. Okay, so I'll probably try and clean something up and then go through the cleaned up code base with you together.